Squadron was born in Egypt in September of 1916. It was made up of elements from 1 squadron, plus some people from the light horse regiments, Australian light horse regiments. And then the main group, that was the Egypt group, the main group came by ship from Australia, around about 220, 230 people to form a squadron of 250. Interestingly, it was first called number 69 Squadron, a Royal Air Force terminology. It wasn't until a few months later that the government of Australia wanted the Australian units to be given Australian identities, so that was then changed to number 3 Squadron and remained with us to this day. They formed up at a place called South Carlton in Lincolnshire in England with aircraft provided by the Brits, which was the RAAFs. That turned out to be a very good aeroplane for us. There are about 250 men in the squadron. When they arrived there, they had some training in Australia, but fairly raw. They spent the best part of a year actually in England being trained up to become a reconnaissance squadron, but an armed reconnaissance squadron, not a passive reconnaissance squadron. And a year later, they had the honour of being the first Australian squadron to move to France. The first location was a place called Saint-Omer, and it's actually up near Dunkirk in the northwest corner of France. Other locations were Bailleul in the Messines area, another place called Abbeville. They had a major base a little bit later on at Poulainville, and then the two that the public know best would be the Somme, which of course was a terrible battleground, and later Hamel, H-A-M-E-L. Hamel was quite a big success for the Allies. In each of those areas, 3 Squadron were in desperate support of the ground troops. That's what it was all about. What one reads about, because obviously it's before my time and our time, what one reads about was that they were somewhat lost. It was a very, very bad war. More servicemen killed in World War I than World War II, even though it lasted a shorter time. And there weren't a lot of things going for them. There was a terrible lot of amputees and people with terrible mental problems going back into Civvy Street. And they were really pleased the war was over. In fact, they took umbrage at having to stay back after the armistice on the 11th of November 1918 to do various chores in France and Belgium. But it was rather different, I think, to what happened at the end of World War II, and things were much more. Soldiers were better looked after at that stage, but in those early days a lot of men returned to Civvy Street with virtually nothing for their efforts except problems. The most famous fighter pilot in the German side was probably Baron von Richthofen, He was credited with 80 kills. He put some rounds into the Brits without shooting one down, but an Australian soldier is believed to have killed Richthofen with a single bullet fired from the ground not far from the Poulenville base. Now this was verified because it was the 3 squadron people who went and picked up the body and the aircraft. And that night in the 3 squadron hangar, Major Blake, who was the 3 squadron CO, and 2 other senior officers, one from the Army, one from the Air Force, examined the body, and by the trajectory of the bullet, said it must have come from below. Had it been from a machine gun, there would have been several bullets in that local area, but with a single bullet suggests it came from a rifle. Baron Richthofen, the Germans were very impressed that the 3 squadron actually buried him with the full military honours, firing party and all, and they sent back to the German base Richthofen, not his body because he was buried there, but they sent back parts of the aircraft and some of Richthofen's personal belongings. Germans were quite impressed with the chivalry of that. Those sort of chivalries were not unknown in the First World War. They were rather less prosecuted later on in aviation history. There is a little side to that. It was rumoured, and it's probably right, that one of the 3 squadron Erks, one of the ground crews, souvenired his boots, Richthofen's boots, and held on to them for quite a while. And another party told me recently that he thinks they're in the Australian War Museum. Another first for 3 Squadron was to be the first fighter squadron to go to France in 1940. Even though the war actually started in 1939, it was regarded as a bit of a dead war for some time, and the action didn't get really going until 1940. Now the squadron formed up at Richmond in New South Wales and all went by ship to Middle East, into Egypt. They were initially operating pretty old-fashioned aircraft, Lysanders, which weren't even armed, and they had some gauntlets and aircraft like that. It was some little time before they actually got a decent fighter airplane, which was the Hurricane. They were designated as initially as a reconnaissance squadron, a bit like their forefathers in World War I, but that soon translated into aerial battles, and they always were a fighter bomber squadron. They're very effective. Again, maybe the heritage comes from World War I, and they became very good fighter bomber squadron. The living conditions for the Desert Air Force people were absolutely atrocious. They lived in tents. All the workshops were in tents. There were no buildings because of the fact that they frequently moved forwards and backwards as the front changed position. They had sand in everything, all their machinery, the guns in the aircraft, the engines, the food that they ate, the cooking utensils. It was impossible because they were in sand storms a lot of the time. The sand got into everything. And yet everything you hear about it, you hear the old boys talk and you read the books, they were pretty much uncomplaining. When you prosecute a war, I think it's fair to say that people don't often complain because the results of not putting your best foot forward and losing a war, the results of that are just incredible to contemplate.
It was extremely difficult over brakes and various things. The sand apparently affected the brakes, which weren't like nowadays. And it was always difficult from the point of view that you had no tools workshop or anywhere, even a bench. If the thing broke down, it was pretty terrific.
I mean, you know, your whole society would be completely disrupted, turned upside down 100%. So in wartime, people tend to accept the hardships and just go for it.
There's 239 wing, and there was 5 squadrons. 3 British, 1 South African, and the Australian. And at night time, there was a girl on the radio in Germany, apparently, would sing us a song about the buglers, you know, the Naples one, and finish up. She would say what's going to be bombed, and she'd say, you 3 squadron, why don't you go home? The Yanks, and look after your girlfriends. The Yanks are doing it pretty well.
At one stage in the North African campaign, they were reputed to have the largest fleet of vehicles in North Africa, bar none. Americans, Turks, Canadians, New Zealanders, they had it because they used to steal them. And they were very professional, having acquired, that's what we won't use steal, having acquired a vehicle, they would rush it into one of their tents and out would come the spray guns and the paint cans, and it would be hastily modified and presented as one of their own vehicles. Quite frequently the CO had to call them to account, call them all together, read the Riot Act, especially when one of the vehicles that they acquired belonged to, say, a British brigadier who didn't take a very kindly rent. So they were called the hydraulic squadron because they could lift anything.
So good that when you parked your vehicle, you had to take a part off.
So it wouldn't be
like the distributor cap or something, and hand it in with your key for that one, because they'd taken the truck that was there. I had a beautiful big Mercedes, the twin engine thing that we stole.
The 3 Squadron did remarkably well. The Kitty Hawk was the aircraft that was the most successful. They got Kitty Hawks, they got Tomahawks, which was an early version of the Kitty Hawk immediately after they stopped flying the Hurricanes. The Kitty Hawk and the Tomahawk were virtually the sole Air Force, the sole 3 Squadron type aircraft for 3 years, right through the North African campaign and right through the Eastern Mediterranean and Yugoslavian areas. The Kitty Hawk carried that by itself, and it was a brilliant aircraft. Can you imagine a little fighter like that carrying 2,000 pounds of bombs? Well, a 1,000-pounder and 2 500s, and ammunition, because they had 4.5 cannon in the wings. So on takeoff, I mean, and it only had a 1,200 horsepower Allison engine, where the British Merlin engine was 1,700 horsepower, which they appreciated later on when they got the Mustangs.
Oh, great, absolutely. The esprit de corps was so high, and many of the friendships that I formed then I still hold very dear to me.
The tradition was that, although it was a very, very sad thing, because for the pilots especially, the pilot wasn't just your wingman or just a fellow who flew in your flight or in your squadron or indeed in your wing. When he was killed, they quickly gathered up his accoutrements from the tent, organised a replacement as quickly as possible. That night in the mess, the CO would lead all the remaining pilots in a drink to the departed. From there on, it wasn't pucker to talk about that fellow again. Once the war was declared over, everybody felt euphoric because you're not facing death. But that gave way to the realisation that all this wonderful camaraderie that you've had for all these years in a good squadron like number 3 is at an end, and they're going to go their way and you're going to go your way. And the next thing people are thinking about is things like, will my old job be available to me when I get home? I've been away for 4 or 5 years. Will my children remember me? The 3 Squadron was reformed at Canberra with principally Australian-built under licence Mustang fighters, of which we've mentioned. They're very experienced from World War II in those. They also had a bunch of Oster trainers, little light stick and string Osters as trainers, and 2 or 3 Wirraways as interim trainers. And they operated as a liaison squadron for quite a few years after the war, and then they were reformed in 1956 at RAAF Base Williamtown and started getting their first Sabre jets.
I flew in 75 Squadron for a good deal of time in Vampires and these beautiful old aeroplanes, the Sabre, and I had so many incidents, beautiful experiences. It's a bit hard to isolate one from another.
I think most Australians again don't realise what a tremendous aviation manufacturing capacity Australia had in those days. The World War II, they made 700 Beauforts down there, 700. They made 112 Sabres. They made the Mirage. They're making and made the Hornet from the mid-80s. So the Sabres were coming in. That was the Air Force's first transonic jet. Transonic jet, that means that it will fly almost supersonically in level flight, but will go supersonic in a dive. And
my memory is the many years I had with this lovely old aeroplane.
The Sabre.
I participated in two Sabre aerobatic teams, leading them, and some of those were with 3 Squadron.
Well, I suppose the experience from being an apprentice to working on jet aircraft was a big step.
Sure.
And when the Sabres went to Butterworth, I was part of a crew left behind to dismantle 3 Sabres, put them on cradles and load them into a Hercules aircraft. And they were the first ones that went up on the Hercs and not under their own steam, and that was the system from then on.
It was another big technical transition to the Mirage. Being such a high-speed aircraft, they had special features like afterburners, variable stage afterburners, and variable intake ducting to control the airflow change from subsonic to supersonic speed. Pilots had to be increasingly the creme de la creme, the pick of the best.
Because there was a big jump between a Sabre and a Mirage. We never went transonic I should say, and we went straight supersonic, and there was a lot of rumours about it, and they bent a lot of them, put them into the ground. They had a dreaded roll coupling that tumbled them over. But 3 Squadron was a brand new squadron, enthusiastic fellows, very well trained, and my time there was outstanding.
Australia decided to send this 78 fighter wing up to be based at Butterworth in Malaya on the basis of likely military problems between Indonesia and Malaysia. Malaysia and Singapore at the time were not strong militarily. They were just starting to train their jet pilots and get some aeroplanes. So they really needed a friend like Australia to be up there, and I suppose it was a peacekeeping force because we weren't actually fighting a known enemy. We're really peacekeepers. The Hornet was introduced in mid-1986, and this time it was another first. The first truly supersonic interceptor fighter with 2 jet engines. The Mirage, of course, had a single Atar turbojet. Here's an aircraft now with 2 jet engines. Compare it with the Sabre, for instance. Each of those engines is more powerful than the single jet engine that's in the Sabre. So their rate of climb and their speed, over twice the speed of sound, climb and turn at enormous rates, brilliantly designed. Northrop designed them in the United States. They're used by many air forces. As I mentioned before, this is an aeroplane that has been built in Australia, down in the Melbourne government aircraft factories. There's a lot of carbon fibre in the structure. That was something new to the Air Force. We used to have some what we might call reinforced plastic things in earlier aircraft, but they usually weren't structural. Here's an aircraft now that's got bits of the wing and bits of the tail and bits of the other attachments where you'd normally use heavy steel, is now using these CFRP, these carbon reinforced fibre plastics. Defence Force environment is such that in the ordinary commerce of the workaday business, that you do rely on your mates for assistance, because you work in funny places sometimes. You work under quite a lot of difficulties. People around you may be hurt or occasionally get killed, and then everybody has got to get together and help each other. So that old Australian tradition of mateship, I think, is one of the finest aspects of service life.
To join or rejoin or think about rejoining if I was younger, I'd probably wish my education was better, but apart from that, no, I had a ball.
But I appreciated the chance to go to Malaya to see how the other half lives, and it taught me to get on with other people. My wife probably disagree, but yeah, that's it. And we were over there, and we all had a purpose for that first. I think that was the best time to go there, was with 3 Squadron, because we all knew we were going to be there for 2 years, and we all sort of bonded and got the job done. And then later they can't replace you all at once, so they sort of filter people in. And there was never, I wouldn't have thought there was ever the sort of bonding that the initial mob had.
Well, they couldn't get a much better start. With the Air Force these days is very technical. They can learn electronics as well as mechanical engineering, and either way it's a great start. The training's good, and the comradeship, just about everything a young fella could want.
Well, I found that getting overseas service in a war zone was very beneficial to me. You know, after you leave the Air Force, that sort of thing, you get a lot of benefits.
Well, I think there is hardly any better occupation that one might enter. Good training, good comradeship, and incidents that you go on to life still retain your memory.
I would think that the people you work with and the high level of training and the levelling of everybody. There's some that I joined up with and stayed that came from a very poor family. Others were from wealthy families, everything in between, and the service has levelled that, and you make friends there that you can never make in any other areas. You can spend all your life in a small town, you wouldn't have the experiences, you wouldn't have the friends that you do by going through the Air Force.
Oh, I'd be all for it. In fact, I've got young rallies and I've been in their ears about if you want an interesting life, if you want a successful life, if you want to get qualifications, and if you want to see the world, I don't know any other job that you do so well. And not just the Air Force, the military generally. The three services will provide all those things for you. And indeed, a lot of, we were just talking about it the other day, a lot of my 3 Squadron mates and I myself have done very well after being in the Air Force. You know, we learned a lot, we travelled a lot, we learned a lot about life, but we also got our qualifications up and we got good jobs in Civvy Street. And so looking back, where did we get all this? How did we manage to be successful with our lives? It was the Air Force.